Good evening, YouTube. It's your guy J Crew to you, coming at you with another video here on March 14th, 2022. Um, Try to get more frequent with my video productions. As I stated yesterday, or should I say early this morning, because I was up past midnight. So I would actually say early this morning. So had some unfortunate news to report, but I also can say I'm not surprised to hear this. As you see on the screen, there was a story that dropped this evening about uh, ex WWE wrestler Scott Hall. Uh, for those of you who remember Scott Hall, he initially came to prominence like in the 1990s. I would say the early to mid 90s in the WWF, when it was known as the World Wrestling Federation, now known as the WWE, the World Wrestling Entertainment. He initially came to prominence as the character Razor Ramon in the WWF. And for those of you who remember him, and later when he defected to WCW along with his partner Kevin Nash, they formed the NWO, and he had another run with him another run as a wrestler, really on his real name while he was with WCW. And maybe it's not as memorable. It depends upon, I guess, who you ask. But he still made a splash there as well. Either way, Scott Hall actually passed away today. I believe he was in the midst of either having surgery for a hip replacement, or either he had already had it, and I think he had some blood clotting that occurred as a result of his procedure. Again, I don't know if he fully went through with it or maybe he was in the middle of it, but apparently he suffered multiple heart attacks. And it was initially announced earlier today that I think Kevin Nash, who was another gentleman that performed with him while he was in WCW under the NWO Alliance, said that he was on life support. But it was, I guess, quickly determined by this evening that his prospects of surviving were not that good, so they had decided to remove him from life support. And so, unfortunately, he passed away there at the age of 63. Now, I'd like to go into his career because Scott Hall, I think, deserves, some praise, given what he brought to us as entertainers, from an entertainer standpoint, and what he had to go through in life. Some of you might remember, some of you might not remember that on ESPN, uh, the sports show that comes on, that they talk about different sports, and they report on different stories. They have a little side show called E60. And about 10 years ago, they aired a piece on Scott Hall that was somewhat eye-opening. And it kind of reintroduced us, that have maybe forgotten about him. And it also introduced some people for the first time who were too young to remember him. Like I said, they talked about his career a little bit. Originally, Scott Hall was basically a white dude, kind of a white redneck from Florida, who, just kind of like just floating along in life. I think as he was growing up, he had mentioned in the piece that they did on him that he had come from a family full of drinkers. He had come from a family full of guys who basically drank and drugged in his family, and he even jokingly said that some older people, I don't know, it was an uncle or his father, said, "Son, you're gonna fall, but just make sure you don't fall too hard to where you can't get up." They kind of knew he was gonna suffer to a certain extent, from that history of alcoholism in his family. But either way, Scott Hall had a situation that came up early in his life. I think it was early, he was in the early 20s back in the 80s, and he was like a bouncer at a club or something in Florida. He kind of got into it with another dude over a girl at the club, and he got into a fist fight with this guy, and it eventually got to a point where Scott Hall just blew his brains out. He just shot dude in the head and killed him. But somehow, some way, he was able to beat the charge, and he didn't have to do no prison time, as I understood it. But what happened is that, I guess not too long after that, he got a chance to begin as a wrestler, and I think he wrestled under his real name, like in the later '80s, and he really didn't make too much of a wave, at least from what I remember. I don't really remember him wrestling on his real name, but he eventually got to WWF as it was known back then, the World Wrestling Federation, like I said earlier in the video, in the early to mid 90s. And that's when this dude just took off. And when I say took off, as I mentioned before, Scott Hall was like a white dude who was kind of like a redneck from Florida. But when he began to perform under the moniker Razor Ramon in the WWF, when I first saw him with the way they slicked back his hair, he had that toothpick in his mouth, kind of like how he does in this picture, I thought that dude really was Latino. That's how good he was as a performer. When you saw him, it kind of blew you away. I was like, wow, he got the black hair. He's talking like real slow and real cool. And you could tell it was kind of like he was kind of incorporating the character of Scarface. Tony Montana, into his character. That drug dealer who was in the movie Scarface, portrayed by Al Pacino. I think he had even mentioned that piece. He tried to sort of intertwine that character as being a part of him. And he would say, hello to the bad guy. You never seen a bad guy like me. Yeah. He would talk real slow. And he would kind of have these exaggerated slow movements when he was cutting his promos, when he would get ready to wrestle. But that dude was good, man, 'cause I enjoyed watching him. And I remember he had that finishing move called the Razor's Edge, where he would kind of stretch your arms out and put you back to him. And it was like a weird looking slam where he would sort of pull you up like when you were back to him, and he would spread his arm. He would just kind of fall forward, and you would kind of fall down. It was like a simulated head slam or something like that. You probably have to look it up, but he called it the Razor's Edge. And I remember seeing that. I just thought he was one of the cooler guys who was in the WWF way back then. Eventually, Scott Hall got to the point where I don't know if it was a contract situation or whether some of his personal issues kind of got in the way. I can't remember exactly what they said this on the E60 episode, but he got an opportunity to go to WCW, who was a competing company with the WWF back then in the 90s, for those of you guys who remember, the 80s and the 90s. They were a competing company, and WCW was known as World Championship Wrestling. And he went there along with Kevin Nash, and they became known as the New World Order, the NWO. And they became like one of the signature acts that were in, WCW. I can't remember exactly how long he stayed a part of that, but I think, Scott Hall's problems began to become more pronounced as he got older. He began to have more issues with alcohol, drugs, and he even mentioned that in the piece. I think even when they were maybe in the WWF, that he was beginning to have issues with alcohol and drugs, and that were becoming more pronounced. And I don't think they mentioned specifically what he did outside of alcohol, but I think it was pretty hard drugs. And he began to have DUIs, different incidents, and I think both WCW and the WWF kind of canceled his contract because of some of his issues that he had. And I think they even mentioned they tried to bring him back, but his issues were just so pronounced that he couldn't overcome. I think even Stephanie McMahon, who of course is one of the children of Vince McMahon, who's one of the head people over the WWE, they interviewed Stephanie McMahon back then, and she said they had spent, I want to say, either around $500,000 or maybe around $1 million on rehabilitative care for Scott Hall, but it just did not work. He seemed to just continuously struggle. And, he just couldn't rebound from what he had going on. And so they eventually just kind of severed ties with him. And what was really sad was by the end of the episode, that they got to with E60, Scott Hall was shown wrestling, but it was almost like he was wrestling like in different like warehouses, or different places that were much smaller venues. There was even this one infamous match where this minor wrestling organization paid him to show up. And when he came there, he could barely stand. And he really couldn't even perform. And the fans were booing him. they were trash talking him, and not in a good way. I mean, because for those of you who watch wrestling, you would expect the fans to do some trash talking. But with Scott Hall in this particular night, and I forget what organization it was some minor level wrestling organization, but he couldn't even stand up and do the moves. And and I think he had even mentioned that he was so uh I guess inebriated and really off of maybe some medication that he had been taking. He said he didn't even remember it like that. But it was a match that was infamously bad amongst wrestling fans. Because I remember when the next week when that episode went off, I went on social media. People were like, oh, that's the match that I heard about. That's the match that Scott Hall really, really sucked at. Because some more hardcore wrestling fans had heard about it. And they were like, oh, that's the match that everybody was talking about that he was so terrible in. But I really wasn't familiar with that at the time until I saw like the social media rants about that. But it was horrible. I think they paid him, but he really wasn't in good shape. He looked horrible. They even interviewed, I think one of his children, his sons, and he had a son named Cody Hall, I believe, who was trying to wrestle. I don't know whatever came of him, but he was trying to wrestle. And but either way, we all got to go one day. We all got that appointment that we can't cancel, which is death. But you hate to see it when somebody kind of is in this kind of shape as a result of their own demons. But this is a call that he really couldn't avoid. So unfortunately, Scott Hall passed away, today at the age of 63. But he did his thing. I just wanted to sort of pay my respects to him because he was a really entertaining guy, especially he was Razor Ramon. When he became Scott Hall to me, like he was okay, but it wasn't what he was when he was Razor Ramon in the WWE. And I mean I don't know if it was a business decision where Vince McMahon and them didn't want to license his character to WCW to where he could still perform as that. And I'm thinking it probably has to be some business reason why he could continue on as Razor Ramon, because that was his signature character as far as I'm concerned. But I would like to say it's an unfortunate day for wrestling fans across the world who were entertained by Scott Hall. Rest in peace, Scott Hall, man. And you guys have a good evening. If you like the video, click the like button. If you want to subscribe, hit subscribe. It's your boy J. Crew to you, and I'm out for this evening. Have a good one.